Welcome to all of you. May I ask a question? I'll be doing a lot of questioning tonight, but I'm going to begin by asking you a question. How many of you can hear me is one good question.
In the back, are you guys good? All right.
The question is this: how many of you are new to the Graduate Center? Terrific. So that gives me leave to say 2 or 3 words about the Graduate Center. We're a small part of the extraordinary project of opportunity and democracy and investment that is the City University of New York. CUNY has about 285,000 degree-pursuing students, another 250,000 students doing other kinds of non-degree work. The Graduate Center is a small piece of that puzzle. We've got about 4,200 students. About 3,800 of those are doing doctoral work in everything from anthropology to urban education. And they teach annually about 200,000 CUNY undergraduates. So as president of the Graduate Center, I'm very pleased to welcome you and to give you a glimpse of what we do here at the Graduate Center as we immodestly have it in our slogan, the life of the mind in the heart of the city. So welcome. I should say as well that tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Graduate Center's Center, the Department for Public Programs, which produce a lot of our great public programs. I hope there are some brochures that you can pick up. And also by the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, which engages in research, graduate training, and public education in the fields of international studies and contemporary global problem solving. I could not be more pleased to host tonight's event, in part because at least I should know something of the topic, but more selfishly because it's an opportunity to welcome Sarah Chayes, an old friend, back to the Graduate Center. Let me say a few words about Sarah, a word or two about her book, and then a word or two about the framework of our discussion. Sarah is an award-winning former NPR reporter. She's an entrepreneur. She's a writer, she's a foreign policy expert, and she's currently senior associate in the Democracy and Rule of Law program and also the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. While a reporter for NPR, she covered the fall of the Taliban. And then she left journalism to remain in Kandahar in order to contribute to the reconstruction of that country. She became deeply embedded in the life of the city, running an NGO, a manufacturing cooperative, and eventually was tapped to serve as special advisor to the commanders of the International Security Force. In 2010, she became special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and she contributed to strategic policy on Afghanistan, on Pakistan, and also in the Arab Spring. Sarah has a book which has just been published in paperback, Thieves of State. It was published last winter and is available, and I should say that Sarah will make herself available to sign copies when we are finished. Now, Thieves of State made a terrific splash with media outlets ranging from The New Yorker to The Daily Show. I watched Sarah on The Daily Show, and I must say she managed its host extremely effectively. I urge you to pick up the book. It is a marvel of writing and lucidity. It's got a wonderful sense of place. And I would be remiss if I'd betray a kind of autobiographical detail, which was that Sarah Chayes, about 25 years ago, gave me advice on my writing, which I still haven't forgotten.
I don't remember this.
It's too embarrassing to tell in public. So what I propose to do is the following. It's 6:37 or 6:38. We'll speak to about, Sarah and I will have a conversation until roughly 7:20 or 7:25. Then we'll open the floor up for questions, and we do welcome your questions. So Sarah, I do want to agree with the praise that's been given your book. It's beautifully written. It's got a vivid and immediate sense of place, and it draws upon your long and your firsthand experience in Afghanistan. It does so not merely, I think, in the service of telling what is a pretty dolorous tale of corruption in Afghanistan, but also in the service of drawing lessons from that particular experience that I think are very relevant to many of what might appear to be disparate crises that are in the headlines virtually every day, crises such as the East-West standoff in the Ukraine and the meltdown in Syria. So I'll get you to think comparatively, but since you and I did meet in 1986 as first-year graduate students in early Islamic history, the obvious question would be, how did you get from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Kandahar, Afghanistan?
It's called the Raggedy CV. He has a CV that is actually presentable. My CV is one that's sort of darned, with heavy-duty threads. So what did I do? I bailed a lot. He watched me bail out of graduate school, and he's going to say something really nice about, I escaped and, did the right thing or something like that. But it didn't look like that at the time. So if I gave him advice about his writing, he was giving me a lot of advice about, how to be a responsible student, which I failed to follow that advice. And I went to work for a now defunct radio called Monitor Radio. Went to France, picked up the NPR string, and that's how I became an NPR correspondent. And then, sort of who do you want to be on December 12th, 2001, but the gal who is a radio correspondent with a background in Islamic history, right? So that's how I wound up in Afghanistan. And it was just this incredible moment where somehow the whole world was suddenly revolving around, although, neither of us focused on that particular corner of the Islamic world, but and then you've been a journalist for a number of years, and you're making your living off of other people's drama, with no responsibility for how it comes out, and so it just seemed like it was time at that particular juncture to shut up already and do something. So I bailed again. So that's that was the next place where the darning needle had to come out.
So you found yourself in Afghanistan, and for those of you who don't know Sarah's corpus of work, I also take the opportunity to recommend a book called The Punishment of Virtue, one of my favorite titles, The Punishment of Virtue, Inside Afghanistan After the Taliban. Maybe you can say a few words. I don't think it's that common. There are the Gertrude Bells of the world, the Freya Starks of the world, women who have lived and traveled, intrepid adventurers in the Middle East. Give us some sense of what it was like in that period and how you assembled the extraordinary ethnographic, personal material that fills.
It's so, and those 1930s, basically, heroines, there's no comparison. I mean, those women, the world that they were exploring, we just have to think back to how trackless the worlds that they explored were. But what I find quite interesting, and I don't know if they experienced this, but what I experienced in Kandahar, and Kandahar was fairly hairy in 2001, 2, 3. It was a pretty frontier, wild sort of place. But what I found was, number one, people interacted with you based on how you conducted yourself. There was not as much judging of books by their cover as can sometimes be the case in other places. And the other thing I discovered was that who you want to be in Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2001 to whatever, is a Western female, because you're the only person who can actually interact on both sides of the gender divide. And the way I did that, and forgive me because now I'm going back to the covers, is initially when I arrived and I started reporting, these are people who had not seen the face of a female in 6 years, outside. So I would just get out of a vehicle and I'd have 50 people around me. And it's like, I can't report this way. Like it's, that's not going to work. And so I went to the principle of optics, which says the human eye doesn't actually see everything that we think we see. Our brain connects the dots. So I said, let me dress up as, let me make myself look like what they think they're going to see. And if I'm driving a vehicle, I better look like a guy. So I wore Afghan men's dress with a turban and the whole thing. And I functioned as a male in that environment, except when I was with women. And then, excuse me, this is a public lecture, so I probably shouldn't go down this road, but at some point I go into this sort of private part of a house, and the gals stick their hand down my front to make sure I can, and I got two of them, But it was absolutely extraordinary to be able to interact. And then around 2005, I set up a little cooperative, a little manufacturing cooperative to sort of at least demonstrate sustainable economic activity. It makes skincare products, so any of you who don't buy the book, you have to buy the soap. It's arghand.org. And I've just lost my thread. Oh no, I know what I was going to say, is we had men and women working. This was not a women's cooperative, it was a men's and women's cooperative. And so we had men and women working together, which was even more revolutionary, I think, than a women's cooperative. And for guys too, the separation of the genders is so intense in Kandahar that if you had a friend that literally was as old a friend as we are, who was male, not only would you never have seen his wife, you would not know her name. And that meant that the guys in my cooperative had nobody to talk to about their family issues. So anyway, this is a little bit off the track of foreign relations, but it was a really remarkable experience, and I found myself feeling quite comfortable. There was another kind of interesting thing, Kandahar, again, just sort of look on the internet or something, and it's, the whole turbans and the shawls and all of this stuff. And a friend of mine who had been an anti-Soviet mujahid in the day was in Kabul. And another friend of mine, a woman, was sort of part of the Kabul intelligentsia, the kind of the community that one would have thought I would feel more comfortable with. And I always felt a little awkward with her intelligentsia friends. And I said, hey, come down, see Khan Mahmad. She came away, she was sort of frightened to be in the room with this guy. And it's just so interesting how these social relations work. But in some ways, I think as an American, we're also pretty straightforward. And so you start to pick up, it actually matters what tribe you're from. And so I'd make tribal jokes and people would laugh, and here's this American making tribal jokes, and so.
Well, it's interesting because what you're surfacing is an anthropological
That's right.
kind of instinct
That's
that you
right.
had. And you and I am sure agree that you did not acquire that instinct in the Department of
Right.
Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations where I was a student. But the more serious question or point would be, perhaps slightly mischievous, the paucity of American anthropological linguistic expertise in post-war Afghanistan and Iraq is proverbial.
Absolutely.
Could you just share with us some sense, the local sense that you had, for those of us who've read about it and have been astounded by it?
Absolutely great, and critical. So, and this is going to be, we'll probably come back to this issue, but what I would notice, for example, if Chayes had a friend he wanted to introduce me to, what he would basically do is verbally do the network diagram. Meaning, my friend so-and-so is a Barakzai from, you'll know so-and-so, he's a Barakzai from this part of Arghandab district. And I would say, oh, you're a Barakzai from Arghandab district? Well, I wonder if you know so-and-so. And basically, you do the chink, 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 chink until you figure out how you are related in some way to that person. And that also means, so there were a couple of tribes, it became clear to me, I somehow sort of felt that I adopted the Achikzai tribe, and they had rivals who were the Nurzais. Now, what was really interesting is the Nurzais tended to be more leaning toward the Taliban. And that meant that you really needed, if you wanted to know where what the military calls the rat lines are, you need to know where the Nurzai village is. Not that everybody in Nurzai villages are Taliban, but that's where it's likely to be easiest for Taliban to move. And so I would be saying, do you people, to the US military, for example, and we're talking 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005 years, do you have any maps of the tribal laydown here? And I would get these things with these broad circles, right, or ovals, right? There are a lot of Nurzais here. I'm saying, that's not helpful to you at all. And this was the days when they had, digital camouflage with the, I'm like, when you guys are doing patrols, ask people what's the dominant tribe in this village and color it in. And you want to have a map that's, and this was simply, it didn't start happening until about 2007, 8, 9, and then, in the usual style, it goes too far the other way, where everything is all about tribes. So what Ahmed Wali Karzai would do, who was President Karzai's younger half-brother, who was running the kleptocratic network in the area, which we'll talk about shortly, is that, and Bashar al-Assad did this also in Syria, and we can, again, make this comparison, but you federate across the identity divide at the top of the kleptocratic network so that you have co-opted the leadership of different tribes, while at the bottom, the people remain divided across their identity divides. And so that makes it very difficult for the people at the bottom to resist this structure, but it looks great to Americans. Ahmed Wali Karzai would say, I've got an Achikzai here, I've got 2 Barakzais, I've got, I'm inclusive. And Americans couldn't see past the tribal designations to understand what he was doing.
Right. So let's turn, shall we, since you've introduced the term kleptocracy, let's turn to the kleptocratic state. And particular Thieves of State. The book identifies a number of historical, religious, and economic variables that explain at least some of the reactions to severe corruption, to kleptocracy. You've begun to answer the question, I think, but I'm sure the audience would like to know more. What, in your experience, living and working Afghanistan, everything from the quotidian to perhaps the political, what led you especially to reflect on that relationship between corruption, state building, and extremism?
So this, forgive me, because this is going to be a little bit of a long riff. So I was immediately confronted with corruption in ways that I think it's more familiarly talked about, which is to say as a development challenge. The very first project I did was to rebuild a village that had been destroyed in the US anti-Taliban bombing. And if you take a look at a picture of southern Afghanistan, those of you who haven't been there, it's about the only resources that are plentiful are 2, sunshine and rock. But we were rebuilding mud brick villages, so there's some dirt too. So most of the raw materials were plentiful. You need, even for mud brick houses, you need stone foundations. And so we needed to quarry some stone, or we needed to purchase stone from the quarries, except the governor had awarded himself a monopoly on stone so that he could sell it to the Americans who were building their, base down there at the airport, and they need gravel, of course. Every military base is paved in gravel. So the governor was selling tractor loads of gravel to the Americans for $100 when they're only worth $8, and therefore we couldn't get any stone. So, I eventually got stone, but that really showed me how corruption directly gets in the way of the most basic development objectives you might have. It took me quite some time. Then people are coming to me complaining about corruption all the time, for years. It took me some time to understand that it's not just a practice committed by some venal individuals. And I'd even say that, I mean, it's a word, corruption, right, that's coming back into fashion. I just voted, I came here from Washington via Boston, because that's where I vote, and it's kind of interesting to hear the word corruption reintroduced into our own political discourse, right? However, when people, even they're thinking, trying to use ugly words to describe it, it's, you know, corrosion or cancer or epidemic, or the notion is you've got a body that's more or less intact, and then corruption is somehow creeping in, or it's attacking it like a disease or something like that. And what I discovered when I moved from Kandahar up to Kabul and started looking at this as a system was, wow, this isn't a case of a fragile or a failing government. It's a case of a sophisticated and successful criminal organization that is achieving its objective, which is maximizing resources for network members. And that was like, wow, it was like turning the whole, you know, kaleidoscope. And that has some implications. One is that, and I can, you know, we could talk about this more in questions, but it's a vertically and horizontally integrated organization. And it takes the elements of state function that are normally supposed to be part of how a government, you know, takes care of its people and bends those elements of state function to serve the purposes of the network. And that means, on the one hand, that there is no recourse. There's no recourse through normal earthly channels, right? And I'll give you a quote that's in the book that doesn't come out of the Afghan or the Islamic tradition. It comes out of our tradition. John Locke, anyone read him? Right? One of our guys, right? So in the second discourse on government, he says, when there is a barefaced wresting of the laws to, and he uses some fancy word, I think it's to, but it adds up to serve the purposes, of a man or a party of men, war is made on the sufferers. So it's a pretty strong, you know, statement. Who, lacking an appeal on earth to right them, are left to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. He's basically predicting violent religious extremism as not necessarily the best or the most constructive or productive reaction to this, but a way that humans are likely to go. And that guy was a Puritan. And so let's just take a look at, you know, what that whole episode looked like. So that's one piece of it, is when you don't have recourse in normal nonviolent ways, there's a tendency to turn to a higher authority. The second point that I think, you know, here we are talking in the city of New York. I came here from the city of the District of Columbia. We all are somewhat familiar with corruption, right, in our, you know, local lives. But we don't get shaken down on the street by corrupt local officials. And so we tend to underestimate the degree of humiliation that attends that experience. The cop who's shaking you down does not say, look at, sir, we have a really low salary here. I mean, and I've got 4 kids, which, you know, it's not a polite interaction. It's abusive, it's arrogant, it's demeaning, and often it's a very poor person who's being shaken down. So not only is his no or her no surplus being taken away from him or her, but it's their dignity is being robbed. And just one anecdote, which is a pretty extreme one. So the book starts with an anecdote from Afghanistan, so I'll leave that one aside. But a couple of years ago, I was in northern Nigeria talking to justice sector professionals about just the mechanisms of corruption. Where are the toll booths? Where are the places where money is taken from people? Prosecutor says, Sarah, you're just talking money. This isn't just about money. And I said, oh, really? And he tells me the story about the lady whose husband is diabetic and he's in pretrial detention, and she's begging the judge, release him on bail. I guarantee I will deliver him for trial. And the judge takes advantage of her. I'm furious at myself for not having thought of that. It's called sextortion, and how have I not been thinking about this as a variety of corruption? And then the security professional kicks in, and I start thinking about her brother. What does her brother want to do to the judge who raped her? He wants to kill him, right? This is northern Nigeria. There's a Boko Haram, there's an insurgency right next door that wants nothing more than for this young man to shoot the judge, and is going to hand him the Kalashnikov to do it. And then they hand him the argument. So I finally made it to Maiduguri, which is the Nigerian version of Kandahar. It's the birthplace of Boko Haram. I made it there at the end of last year. And I sat with people in the neighborhoods, and and they're saying, see where that sign is, that's where Muhammad Yusuf was preaching. And I said, well, what was he saying? He was saying the truth. He was telling us about how our government officials were abusing us, and everything he said was true. And then he said, the reason they're treating you this way is because of the secular constitution of Nigeria. Now that's cheating. It, of course, wasn't true. What those officials are doing is violating the Constitution of Nigeria. However, when that treatment is so pervasive and people haven't actually read the Constitution of Nigeria, it's pretty plausible. I mean, what the guy was saying is the reason they can be this corrupt in the broadest sense of the word corrupt is because they don't obey God. And if only our government were organized according to God's law, it wouldn't be this way. Now, it's a spurious argument, but back to, John Locke.
Sure. So let's pause there, and let me put what might sound, at least at first appearance, a kind of academic question. I suppose corruption is as old as man.
Sure.
But then again, in 1977, there was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that was passed, and its definition of corruption boils down to gifts or payments to officials to exercise influence. You've had now direct experience of a kind of corruption. Does that definition suffice? What would be the kind of taxonomy of corruption? How do we make sense of it? I think especially given our own moment in which at least one candidate for the presidency is arguing that our political system is corrupt at its core, and that money is the corrupting influence.
Absolutely brilliant question, and I want to answer it in two different ways. I want to answer it for some of the other countries and then answer it for America. And for some of the other countries, one of the things I often heard from US officials when I was saying, you are not going to reduce, you're not going to achieve an improvement in the security situation in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq if you don't address the corruption and governance problem. You can send 1 million soldiers there. It's not going to durably change that situation unless you address this thing. What I would get was, Sarah, what are you hopping up and down about corruption for? This is part of their culture over there. And that got so irritating because I would hear this only from Americans. I have never, in Uzbekistan, in Tunisia, in Nigeria, in, Azerbaijan, ever heard a person, when I have these conversations about corruption, say, Sarah, you're really imposing a lot of Western norms here. We don't really mind it. It's okay, it's part of our culture. I've never gotten that. What I would get, so at some point when I was frustrated with getting this question from US officials, I started asking my Afghan friends, villagers and others, what's corruption? And I would get a narrative. I wouldn't get a dictionary definition, I would get a narrative. One was, for example, if I have to pay a government official in order to submit a public document, and another guy has money to make the payment and I don't, I am trampled underfoot. It's a really, again, it's a very powerful, and so I do think a lot of it boiled down to if you have to pay a government official to do his or her job, or you can pay him not to do his or her job, that's corruption. But another narrative I got was, When the development, this was from a farmer, an illiterate farmer who grows grapes west of Kandahar. When the development assistance, basically US development assistance, which is just called HELP, goes to the district governor, and he keeps it all for himself, and he surrounds himself with armed thugs so we can't come to him with our complaints, with our grievances. That's corruption. So it's a little bit wider than taking and giving bribes. So that's those types of countries. Another one, let me just do one other on those types of countries, which is Nigeria. So Boko Haram, right? Western education is forbidden. So we all think about, here we are at a great educational institution, and it causes our hackles to rise. It causes my hackles to rise when I hear an organization that is targeting education. I mean, what more despicable approach could there be than attacking, the life of the mind, right? So then I get to Nigeria and I start interviewing people about corruption, and what I hear is from everyone that I talk to, north, south, whatever, politicians are bad, but the worst is the civil service. Because in Nigeria, a lot of the corruption, there is a lot of the extortion of bribes, but a lot of the corruption also, they've got oil there, and so there's oil money, and so the corruption happens in public procurement fraud. And it turns out the politicians don't know how to write the contracts. It's the perm rep, or sorry, the perm sec, the permanent secretary, and the other, very specialized civil servants who are able to write the double budgets with the padded amounts and things like that. So how do you get to be a civil servant in Nigeria? You go to school. What was the Nigerian educational system set up for? It was set up to create a civil service for the Brits, which would help the Brits at the time extract resources and send them out to Britain. So, and oh, by the way, the people who set up that educational system were also trying to convert people to Christianity. So you start to see, again, this is not trying to excuse the behavior of Boko Haram, but it puts that whole anger at the educational system in a slightly different light, to hear it that way. So that's there. Now let's talk about here, and I'd like to just doff my hat to another New Yorker whose name is Zephyr Teachout, right? Please, after you've bought Thieves of State and some soap, buy Corruption in America, because she addresses in a very deep way the question you just asked, which is to say, how do we define corruption in this country? And what she really gets at is that the Constitution itself is a corruption prevention mechanism. And she advocates we should go back to addressing corruption upstream of when it actually takes place. So for example, I was a federal government employee, and there is a very, very rigid rule on foreign gifts. We all went with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Kuwait for the whatever anniversary of the Gulf War, and we all got very nice watches, every one of us on the airplane. We all had to give in those give those watches to the federal government. If I wanted my watch, I had to buy it. That's because it's in the Constitution. And it's in the Constitution because the point is not that every single gift is a corrupt action. I was not personally being corrupted by the government of Kuwait. However, the founders said, you know what, let's just remove the whole temptation. Let's take the temptation off the table. And what Zephyr Teachout shows is that we've drifted towards an ex post punishment of corruption, which means you need to define it. And we're defining it very, very, very narrowly. So next door to me, Virginia, we had a governor who got convicted of corruption. But the big issue was there a quid pro quo? And so it's almost to the point where you actually have to sign a contract saying, Chase, $180,000, I want the following 3 votes. Well, no, that's not how it works. It's a gift economy. I mean, Washington's way more sophisticated than that. And so let's go back to John Locke, who says when there is a barefaced wresting of the laws to serve the purposes of a man or a party of men, Wall Street, energy, health industry, military industrial. Are these parties of men and women who have succeeded in wresting the laws to serve their purposes? I think arguably we're on the continuum in the United States.
So one thing everyone will have noticed by now is Sarah's remarkable comparative breadth. Afghanistan, northern Nigeria, Tunisia, United States. That breadth also is chronological in the book, Thieves of State. And let me illustrate that, and this is by way of turning to the question of the relationship between corruption and extremism. Chapter 13, Violent Extremists. You begin with the Reformation and Luther's radical critique of church indulgences. Without doubt, you write, the Reformation, which ignited wars and toppled kingdoms in one of the most sweeping upheavals in Western history, was a revolution against kleptocracy. You draw a direct parallel between Luther's coruscating criticism of ostentation, your word, and the complaints made by Afghans, by Tunisians and Uzbeks of the corruption in their society. Like the Protestant zealots, they too, you argue, are iconoclasts, like the Protestants. Iconoclasts with a puritanical bent, it might also be said. It's an extremely, I think, powerful comparison. So I think I'd like to have a better understanding of your general model for the relationship between corruption and religious extremism, and then I'll ask you about the rule of law, discursively but also in practice, as part of that reaction on the part of extremists.
So I did a part of this. This is what happens, as you've also noticed, I'm not a short answer kind of gal, so it was always a problem with exams, but I've done a piece of this, which is how do you get to sort of puritanical or to God's law, let's put it that way. But let's look at John Locke, right? He was a Puritan, and as I'm doing this research, and as you've noticed, it was not European history. Has anyone ever heard of the Dutch Revolt? I had never heard of it until I started working on this. But what I found was, I was kind of looking at this appeal on earth stuff. So, our Constitution, the English Civil War, really interesting brick in that wall because during the English Civil War, they actually put their king on trial. They didn't just stab him in the back or poison him or something like that. They put him on trial. So that was another piece of the puzzle, and as I'm reading into this, I'm hearing all this stuff about the Dutch Revolt. So I go back and look at the Dutch Revolt, and that's what caused me not to use the Declaration of Independence, because the Dutch already did it 200 years before we did. They thought up, government as a contract and all this kind of thing. But that was also tinged with religion. It was a Protestant. It was both a political and a religious breaking away from the Catholic divine right Habsburg Empire. And so I'm looking at this stuff and I say, what's with these Protestants? What's with these Puritans? And that is what took me back to the 95 Theses. And indeed, it's all about corruption. It's about indulgences, it's about, simony, it's about and in fact, in the back of the book, there are some diagrams, very schematic diagrams for how the kleptocratic networks of Afghanistan, Tunisia, Egypt, Uzbekistan work. And there's enough material in the 95 Theses and in the petitions that the German people were sending to Rome around the same period in the early 16th century. There's enough detail there to be able to draw a schematic diagram of the Catholic Church in 1500 as a vertically integrated criminal organization. So that's in there too. And what I found really fascinating in the Dutch Revolt is there's indeed an episode of iconoclasm in the middle of it, 1566. And I had always thought that iconoclasm was a specifically religious thing about not showing the face. And so I thought it really was focused on the faces of statues or paintings or whatever. And as I read into it, what I found was not at all. They were going after the buildings. They were going after the plate and the linen and the marble and everything that represented the extorted wealth of the church. And there was this incredible anonymous thing, little snippet from the Netherlands that was talking about parading the statues, around town during the feast days, which is still done in some places. What I didn't realize is that the statues were dressed up in brocades and silks and jewels, and people are obliged to line the streets to sort of adore these statues as they're going by, and they're getting their noses rubbed in the money that is being extorted from them. And so the comparison with Afghanistan was those fancy SUVs and big fat houses that the contractors who were milking the money off of the top of our development assistance were buying for themselves. And it's the same, it's also a kind of humiliation. So there's the direct humiliation of the shakedown, and then there's a humiliation of the flaunting of the kind of illicitly gotten gains. So that was a parallel, and I have to say, when I thought about how they went after these churches in 1566, I couldn't help thinking about the towers. I mean, I'm not trying to draw this as an identical, this isn't an identical thing, it's not going to come out the same way, but there are some really remarkable parallels, and even in the dress. So we went to school in Massachusetts, the turnpike of Massachusetts, this emblem, remember that? It was the Puritan hat, right? The little black hat with an arrow through it. So look at the Salafi dress. There's this uniform that the sort of more extreme wing of Wahhabi Islam wears. It's a very bizarre uniform that doesn't come out of the culture of any of these particular places. So were Puritan uniforms. If you were in the Netherlands or in England or a Huguenot or in Plymouth, you were wearing ostentatiously sober clothes that sort of marked you out as being part of this community. So the parallels, I found them way more striking than I had expected.
So there's a performance of opposition. And
yeah, and of puritanicalness, of eschewing this ostentatious display of wealth.
So let's turn to that category of fundamentalists and iconoclasts that we call Islamists. And I want to turn to this question of arguably the central plank in the Islamist campaign, which is law.
Right.
And I think there are two different ways of interpreting or understanding, not mutually incompatible. I'd like just to understand where you put your emphasis. I think the conventional way to explain the rise of Islamism is to present their popularity, at least in part, as a result of an appeal to law and order. After all, for the most part, they're generated in societies in which societies riven by civil war, by conquest, in which the rule of law doesn't exist or is highly contested. But your book made me wonder whether or not the appeal is less to the rule of law as it is to some underlying sense of fairness that the law was actually manifesting or codifying. How do we make sense?
Justice rather than sort of, I kept hearing, I think you're exactly right. And I love that dichotomy because I would often hear swift justice. When people would grudgingly say something positive about the Taliban, it would be swift justice. It would be, law and order. Whereas, and there was some of that. And it certainly was not, believe me, Kandaharis in 2001 were delighted to be rid of the Taliban. And that's why I think this whole sort of arc has been such a tragedy, because we sort of took people who were done with this. They had tasted it, and they really were vaccinated. And by 5, 6, 7 years later, they're saying, you know what? That was sort of better than this. But in particular, so there certainly was people were afraid to break the rules. But there's also a fundamental justice element to this, and that was, and I watched it, I watched by 2008, people are literally choosing to go to Taliban justice, where there is an option, where there's a panoply of jurisdictions, and I watched people do jurisdiction shopping, you know. And what they said was, first of all, the Taliban could, so some of the tough stuff, they could subpoena people, because people knew that if the Taliban subpoena you and you don't come, they're gonna enforce that subpoena. But the second point was they were not judging systematically on behalf of connected people or people who were paying them. And so it was the only jurisdiction before which ordinary people felt like they had a chance of getting a fair shake. And so people were selecting Taliban justice over the other options that were available to them. And it's pretty scary. Now, again, I don't think it always works out that way. I mean, the folks who were listening to Muhammad Yusuf, you know, preaching 10 years ago, and who then experienced Boko Haram, you know, regret that they, you know, they were very lucid about it. They said, we loved it. We agreed with him. We were thrilled when Boko Haram started going after the, and interestingly, justice sector people. Boko Haram went after police, some local administration, but also judges, right? And let me give you another example of exactly what you're touching on. When I had that conversation with the justice sector professionals in Kano, which is not where Boko Haram emerged, but these are folks dressed like this gentleman right here. They were dressed, one was the chairman of the State Bar Association, right? I mean, they're not wearing what I was wearing in Kandahar. And they were explaining there had been a Sharia law movement in Nigeria that started around 2000, 2001, where Sharia law now is part of the whole legal setup in northern Nigeria. And they said, you know what? We thought it was going to be our Sharia, and we thought the thieves were going to get their hands cut off. Now, they didn't, like, right? You know, that's not something that you're quite in favor. Like, they weren't actually talking physically about the guy who pickpockets you, you know, on the street corner getting his hand physically cut off. It was a metaphorical thing. What they meant was the thieves in Washington are going to get their hands cut off. The thieves in Abuja are going to get their hands cut off. And they said, but we woke up the next morning and the thieves still had their two hands. And we found that it was the same system with the same personnel and the same practices. And some people, not them, but they said, therefore, some people in this community will say there's no reforming this thing. You have to have a revolutionary transformation. And so they saw disappointment with the Sharia law system as being part of what gave rise to Boko Haram. And so that goes directly to your point. And I think it's really applicable to Egypt, too, which is a country you're more familiar with than I am. But I've spent a little bit of time there since, you know, since the revolution of 2011. And what's really interesting is if you look at work on young Muslim Brotherhood-leaning Egyptians today, they are absolutely incandescent. They say, look at our idiotic elders. They went in for this stupid political, you can reform stuff from the inside kind of thing. And look what happened to them. They got mowed down in the streets. They've been mass incarcerated, and they, you know, and a couple of them managed to make it to Turkey. So how did that work for you, huh? And so what you have in Egypt today is a very virulent, we're not hearing a lot about it, but you've got a virulent insurgency going on in Egypt right now.
Sure. So I'm going to ask one more question of Sarah, and while I do, if you've got some questions, you can start to form them in your minds, and there are microphones on both sides of the hall. So the last question issues directly from a point that you just made, which is you cut off the arm metaphorically, and that arm reaches from Washington. Part of the backstory is globalization, the flows of capital. Part of the story is international aid. The last time I looked, the United States spends about $31 billion annually on non-military foreign aid. This money is the fuel for corruption, and corruption, according to your reading, is, as it were, the accelerant for extremism. Should we halt international aid?
It's a really provocative question, and it's one that for a long time I answered. Yeah, let me give you the answer that I would give in Washington, which is no, we shouldn't halt international aid. However, when I talk about this kleptocracy, and I start saying, you know, we have a pretty large intelligence community in the United States. According to things I've read in the newspaper, it takes 60 intelligence professionals to keep one drone in the air. And I will go and talk to members of the intelligence community in the United States and elsewhere, and I'll say, you know what, including at the State Department, which is, you know, and USAID, which is what manages that budget. And there's no reason to exclude military assistance from this whole conversation, military and civilian assistance. What I say is we have to start mapping these, we have got to start structurally analyzing these systems as they actually exist. And what that means is figure out what are the elements of state function that have been repurposed or bent to the services of the kleptocratic network. And they're different in different countries as I've looked at it. And then what are the elements of state function that have been deliberately hollowed out? So in the aid biz, what people love to talk about is capacity deficits, and let's go and do some capacity building. And the notion is that, you know, these folks in this country or that country have poor capacity, and some of them do, some of them really don't, but if there is a structure of the government that is showing a capacity deficit, sometimes that's deliberate. Right? And so we all watched the militaries of 3 different countries collapse in about 30 seconds in 2014, and that was Ukraine, Iraq, and Nigeria. And believe me, we had been pouring a lot of money into the military of Iraq for a number of years prior to that. It was both deliberately weakened so as not to be a threat to the kleptocratic network, and also it was a brilliant revenue stream, as you point out. So you want to study that stuff. You want to figure out those things. You want to figure out what are the key revenue streams. I mean, in Afghanistan, it was international assistance. It was opium. It was some natural resources, not oil, but some minerals, rubies and emeralds, things like that. In different countries, there will be different revenue streams. And then, when I say horizontally integrated, I mean this. We as Americans love to argue about who's worse for your health, the public sector or the private sector, right? So we have this big differentiation between the public sector and the private sector. And then those guys are over here on the licit side of the stage. And over there on the illicit side of the stage are the bad guys, which are, you know, criminals and terrorists. And we've got, you know, sanctions against that side of the stage, the criminals and the terrorists. We are looking at networks here that are integrated across all 4 sectors, meaning you've got the Minister of Public Works' sister-in-law runs the biggest construction company that is doing the big infrastructure projects, and those padded, you know, budgets that I was telling you about is circling in there. Then it's really helpful to have, you know, some people traffickers to get rid of the folks and send them up to Europe. And have them be part of your network, or if you're Ahmed Wali Karzai, you know, have the drug dealers as part of your network, because that's a very significant revenue stream. And it's really helpful if you can have put your hands on some informal instruments of force. So if I had been blown up in Kandahar in 2008, I mean, I don't think it would have dawned on you to question whether the Taliban had just done this because I'm this barefaced American female in downtown Kandahar, right? So isn't it helpful if you're Ahmed Wali Karzai to have some Populzai Taliban as part of your network so you can bump off the people who are inconvenient to you without anybody ever asking a question? So just back to analysis. And there is an aid, this does get to aid. So the point is, before we dump, what was the figure you cited?
31 billion.
$31 billion into countries like this, and not all of them are like this. Wouldn't it be useful for us to map this network? I mean, I would go into a battalion tactical operations center and I would get a great network diagram of the Taliban commander of 20 people. And NYPD can do you a great network diagram of organized crime in New York, but nobody is doing the integrated network diagram. And what's fascinating, and here's where we're going to get back to aid, what's fascinating is when I tell government officials, you want to do this analysis, they say, oh, that's too sensitive. I mean, I cannot tell you how many government officials of our government and other countries' governments say, we can't do that. That's too sensitive. So I'm like, it's too sensitive to learn about the environment, but it's not sensitive to put $31 billion into that environment without knowing what it looks like? So what I'm saying is these aid flows need to be much more carefully tailored to the situation into which they are being injected. And secondly, we cannot continue to systematically say, I mean, I will talk to people at USAID and they'll say, yeah, corruption's bad. Corruption's, you're absolutely right, corruption's bad. But Sarah, if we were to prioritize, we have got to eradicate polio in Pakistan. I mean, if we were to, make corruption the most important issue here, we would not be able, I mean, maybe the Pakistani government would cut off our access to villages to, deliver the polio vaccine. And so I think aid actors have to think every bit as carefully. I've spent most of Thieves of State is about telling security actors, be careful about prioritizing security ahead of corruption systematically and across the board, because your security objectives are going to fade further and further out of reach, as we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Same thing goes for development actors.
I can't recall if it was the governor of Wisconsin or the governor of Florida who said we shouldn't be paying for anthropologists. That's my gratuitous dig at those who question the wisdom of public education. So, questions from the floor. There are, as I said, microphones on both sides. We've got about 12 or 13 minutes.
Oh boy. So try to make the questions brief, and I'll work on making my answers a little bit briefer.
Well, thank you very much. Please.
The question is about Boko Haram, which you referenced. What is the likelihood that groups like Boko Haram will spread throughout the impoverished developing areas of the world, since we have an increasing divide between the have and the have-nots, and tens of millions of people around the world are in dire straits and will probably get worse as time goes on? And if that's...
It's a great question. Yeah. And I think that what I've been saying all evening implies that the answer, which goes in the sense of your question, which is if we don't start addressing, external actors who interact with these environments, and obviously the governments themselves, don't address both the have and have not, but the instrumentalized have and have not. The have and have not, neither, in a country like Nigeria, is not accidental. It's not the result of a kind of anonymous structural economic force. It is a rigged economy, and if that is not, it is a criminalized economy, and if that is not addressed, I don't see any reason why this kind of reach for extremism is not going to continue. Thank you. Sir. Oh, I guess over there we got to do that. Right, alternate. Sorry about that.
Your talk was very convincing, and I'm going to address the last thing you said when you said that the people you would ask about an analysis of the networks of crimes in this country would say, it's too sensitive. It reminds me of officials back home in Haiti. When you ask them the same kind of questions, they say, oh, no, it's too sensitive. And the reason why is that they're part of it. And I've been always wondering, why is that officials in developed countries are pouring so much money into the hands of people who are committing crimes? unless they expect to get some money saved for them in these countries or in some place like the Cayman Islands. So I think there is a culture of crime in the world.
Absolutely.
And my question is, since there seem to be religious connotations in your talk about corruption, I am wondering if our recourse is not spiritual in the sense that we should look at a culture of glorification of sex, money, and power in our own country that makes it easy for these people to be tempted. And, it's all coming from the top, people who have access to this kind of thing.
So this is great, and there are two pieces to this that I'd like to pick up on. One is, if you look at the so there is some degree of direct collusion with the corruption, where literally money from these contracts or the development assistance is going back to Americans and they are stealing it directly. I don't think that explains the breadth of the blindness. However, so who remembers Mayor Bloomberg saying, I want every billionaire in the world to buy property in New York? Anyone remember that? Right. So is every billionaire in the world got their money honestly? I mean, come on. Right? The daughter of the president of Angola is a billionaire. So is he really, so let's parse that a little bit. What he's saying is the business model of New York City requires dirty money. Is that really where we want to be as Americans? I don't. And there's a real consistency to this. And we're going to do this. So in my little initiative, we've got the countries that have, we got a map with the countries that have suffered corruption-related security crises in the last, 8, 10 years. And then we're going to light up the countries that are the destination countries for the money. And what you'll find is that the best scoring countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index are providers of corruption services to the most corrupt countries at the bottom of the list, right? So that's part of what you're saying, but the second part of what you're saying is so deep, and it gets at really what I want to start working on, going forward for a little while, which has to do with the cultural, it has to do with money. I think we are in an ethical crisis in this country and in and it's being there are a lot of other countries that are suffering the repercussions of this. And it has to do, we all know about the money being the root of all evil and stuff like that. But I do feel like there are ebbs and flows of this. And we're in a flow. We're in a flow where money is increasingly the sole yardstick by which people measure their stature, their success, their social standing. And there was a time, I don't want to glorify the past, but I think there have been periods where money wasn't the only one. And in fact, where there was an elegance to downplaying the amount of money that you had. And sorry to keep talking Nigeria, but I've been spending a little more time in Nigeria than some of the other countries of late. And I spent 2.5 weeks there asking people the simple question, has the meaning of money changed in your lifetime? And the answers I got were unbelievably articulate and powerful, and it went to exactly what you're talking about. And what I heard was, it used to be that money was something you used to purchase things that you needed. School fees for your children or clothing or whatever. Now, money is, and it used to matter where your money came from. And I had stories from a number of individuals who said, I once found some money on the ground when I was 7, and I brought it home to my parents, and they beat me because I couldn't explain where the money came from. Whereas today we are glorifying the people who are looting the public treasury, and we're glorifying them for money, sex, as you say. It is this very power, right? But power to get money often rather than money to get power. Thank you very much for that question.
Yeah, do you feel that there's a role at all for the United Nations to play in terms of addressing these issues? Because the United States can't afford to be the policeman for the world.
And I'm not asking the United States to be the policeman of the world. I'm asking the United States to start by reducing the degree to which we're exacerbating the problem. So let's start there. The United Nations, unfortunately, better start at home before they start telling other people how to be less corrupt. It's a nice idea, but the United Nations is one of the most corrupt institutions that there is. But I take your point. And so David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is about to have an anti-corruption summit early next year. And I do feel like this needs to be a coordinated, dimensional campaign here, and that involves no longer, so one of the things I told Cameron's folks is also start at home. Like, if you guys have this summit and you do not address the role of British overseas territories in laundering this kind of money, you're going to be laughed off the stage. You've got to, so there needs to be a federated thing, but also you talk, Chase, about international assistance. What about the World Bank and the IMF? What about the infrastructure loans that are also going directly into the hands of kleptocratic networks, and then it's the people who are on the hook to pay them off? So you're exactly right. There's a significant international dimension to this.
I think 2 more questions.
Could you talk about, for example, in Afghanistan, the perspective of the local people to the Westerners who came, and whether they saw corruption in the way that they carried out activities, or whether it was a different type of corruption, or whether they were clear-eyed about, the contractors who were there and their role and so forth?
Yeah, and that's a really good question too, because and interestingly, in interrogation of Taliban prisoners, motivations, there were questions about motivations, and it was, if you added up the answers that had to do with corruption or governance, they way trumped anything about, the infidels were, tearing up our Qurans. I mean, it was these issues. And here's how it went. Initially, the presumption was, let's put the word democracy aside for the moment, but the presumption was the United States is all about justice and rule-based justice. Oh, wow, we're going to get some rule-based justice that's not rooted in political religion. That's what I was hearing in Kandahar initially. And so there was a real open welcoming of us. I was in Kandahar 2 days after the fall of the Taliban. It wasn't people throwing their hats in the air because they're pretty, conservative people and stuff like that. But the notion was they are going to bring us uncorrupt government that is not ideologically extreme. And so we were welcomed. Then what happened was, and this is an issue that I get into in Thieves of State with some of the other historical material I take up, the notion of what has come to be called command responsibility. So anyone who's looked at human rights law, it's that, I'm the queen and Chase is the, is a feudal lord, and he kills a bunch of people. I am guilty, at my behest, I am guilty by command responsibility. And that was developed, again, in the English Civil War in that period, but it's certainly in much, much earlier texts, people are saying the king is guilty of the actions of his subordinates as though he had committed them himself. And that's how we were seen by the Afghans, is at some point, it didn't matter what we were actually doing ourselves. What mattered was we were responsible for the behavior of the Karzai government. And when it finally got to the point where, the New York Times publishes the millions of dollars in bags of cash going to Karzai, which we all kind of knew and suspected and stuff like that. But the people, I asked a friend of mine, I wasn't in Afghanistan when that story broke, I said, so what are people saying? And he said, well, they're saying you must want the corruption. And that's really how it was seen, was if the Afghan government is this sort of fabulously corrupt on your watch and you keep building them up and saying it's the democratically elected government of Afghanistan when everybody knows the votes were frauded, out the whatever, then they say, well, okay, this is the outcome that you want. You selected for corruption, and I don't see how I could argue against it. It's really difficult to make the argument that, oh no, we're acting in good faith and this is the sovereign government of Afghanistan.
So I'm under strict orders to stop. So one more question, as brief as possible, and Sarah, you're allowed a yes or no answer,
Okay.
I think.
So there seems to be two diametrically opposed reactions to corruption worldwide. One, of course, we're seeing, you've talked mostly about in the Middle East and North Africa, religious extremism. But the other, arguably, we're seeing in this country, which is political revolution. So what determines, I mean, what's the difference as to which way you go?
I think the difference, and we're not the only ones doing political revolution. There's actually a number of countries that are way ahead of us in that regard, like Nigeria, where they elected an anti-corruption crusader in an upset victory last year. But let's just go across. Brazil, Guatemala, Honduras, Lebanon, Iraq, Moldova, Malaysia. I mean, we've almost had an international Arab Spring in the last 12 months. It's remarkable what's going on in this regard, and the changes that are happening are remarkable. Just go home and look up Guatemala. They have done some unbelievable things in Guatemala. And so my hypothesis is that going back to John Locke, it has to do with an appeal on earth. So where there are, India is another really interesting one, where there are some possibilities of appeal on earth, you tend to get people turning to those. It turns out that human beings are driven to violent, extreme reactions against their own will. They really don't like to go that way. And I really found that out as I read into the English Civil War and the Dutch Revolt. When you read the pamphlets and the real day-to-day documents, they were trying everything they could do not to unseat their monarch. And in each case, it took years, if not decades, to get them to the place where they felt they had exhausted every appeal on earth, and then they turned to an appeal to heaven.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask of the audience two things. The first, if you value tonight's experience, you can write to your New York State Senator or Assembly person, because right now the governor's executive budget calls for a $485 million cut to the City University of New York. $485 million cut to the City University of New York. An event like this is imperiled. So my first request, if all of you write to your representative, that'll make a big difference. And the second, please join me in thanking Sarah.